guys! How are you today? In this great occasion, I would like to present about types of variables. But before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Shafa Alya Ginanita. I'm from 5BP class. In statistical research, a variable is defined as an attribute of an object of study. Choosing which variables to measure is central to good experimental design. Example, if you want to test whether some plant species are more salt tolerant than others, some key variables you might measure include the amounts of salt you add to the water, the species of plants being studied, the variable related to plant health like growth and wilting. You need to know which types of variables you are working with in order to choose appropriate statistical tests and interpret the results of your study. So, in this presentation, there are three contents that we will discuss. The first one is types of data. It contains quantitative variables and categorical variables. The second one is part of experiment. It contains independent variables, dependent variables, and control variables. And the last one is other common types of variables. It contains confounding variables, latent variables, and composite variables. Okay, without any further ado, let's get started. First, types of data. Data is a specific measurement of a variable. It is the value you record in your datasheet. Data is generally divided into two categories. First, quantitative data represents amounts, and second, categorical data represents grouping. A variable that contains quantitative data is a quantitative variable, and a variable that contains categorical data is a categorical variable. Each of these types of variable can be broken down into further types. Quantitative variables. When you collect quantitative data, the numbers you record represent real amounts that can be added, subtracted, divided, etc. There are two types of quantitative variables. First, discrete variables, as known as integer variables. And second, continuous variables, as known as ratio variables. Discrete variables represent counts of individual items or values. Example, number of students in a class, or number of different tree species in a forest. While continuous variables represent measurements of continuous or non-finite values. Example, distance, volume, and age. Next, categorical variables. Categorical variables represent groupings of some kind. They are sometimes recorded as numbers, but the numbers represent categories rather than actual amounts of things. There are three types of categorical variables. First, binary variables, as known as dichotomous variables. Second, nominal variables. And the third, ordinal variables. Binary variables represent yes or no outcomes. Example, heads or tails in a coin flip, and win or lose in a football game. Nominal variables represent groups with no rank or order between them. Example, species names, colors, and brands. Ordinal variables represent groups that are ranked in a specific order. Example, finishing place in a race, and rating scale responses in a survey. Remember, sometimes a variable can work as more than one type. An ordinal variable can also be used as a quantitative variable if the scale is numeric and doesn't need to be kept as discrete integers. For example, star ratings on product reviews are ordinal, 1 to 5 stars, but the average star rating is quantitative. This is the example datasheet. To keep track of your salt tolerance experiment, you make a datasheet where you record information about the variables in the experiment, like salt addition and plant health. To gather information about the plant responses over time, you can fill out the same datasheet every few days until the end of the experiment. This example sheet is color-coded according to the type of variable. Nominal with the purple color, continuous with the blue color, ordinal with the yellow color, and binary with the green color. The next content is parts of the experiment. Experiments are usually designed to find out what effect one variable has on another. In our example, the effect of salt addition on plant growth. You manipulate the independent variable, or the one you think might be the cause, and then measure the dependent variable, or the one you think might be the effect, to find out what this effect might be. You will probably also have variables that you hold constant, called control variables, in order to focus on your experimental treatment. First, independent variables, as known as treatment variables. Independent variables is variables you manipulate in order to affect the outcome of an experiment. Example from salt tolerance experiment is the amount of salt added to each plant's water. Second, dependent variables as known as response variables. Dependent variables is variables that represent the outcome of the experiment. Example from salt tolerance experiment is any measurement of plant health and growth. In this case, plant height and wilting. Control variables. Control variables is variables that are held constant throughout the experiment. Example from salt tolerance experiment is the temperature and light in the room the plants are kept in, and the volume of water given to each plant. Okay, next, this is the example datasheet. In this experiment, we have 1 independent and 3 dependent variables. The other variables in the sheet can't be classified as independent or dependent, but they do contain data that you will need in order to interpret your dependent and independent variables. Next, the last content of this presentation is about other common types of variables. Once you have defined your independent or dependent variables and determine whether they are categorical or quantitative, you will be able to choose the correct statistical test. But there are many other ways of describing variables that help with interpreting your results. Some useful types of variable are: first, confounding variables. Confounding variables is a variable that hides the true effect of another variable in your experiment. This can happen when another variable is closely related to a variable you are interested in, but you haven't controlled it in your experiment. Example from salt tolerance experiment is pot size and soil type might affect plant survival as much or more than salt addition. In an experiment, you would control these potential confounders by holding them constant. Next, latent variables. Latent variables is a variable that can't be directly measured, but they can be represented via a proxy. Example from salt tolerance experiment is Salt tolerance in plants cannot be measured directly, but can be inferred from measurements of plant health in our salt addition experiment. Last, composite variables. Composite variable is a variable that is made by combining multiple variables in an experiment. These variables are created when you analyze data, not when you measure it. Example from salt tolerance experiment is the three plant health variables could be combined into a single plant health score to make it easier to present your findings. Okay, I think that's all about my presentation. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.